The Valentino heels clicked against the marble floor of my brother's River Oaks mansion, each step echoing through the foyer like a countdown to something I hadn't quite prepared myself for. I'd been in Houston for exactly 4 hours, having flown in from Singapore on a red-eye that left me feeling like I'd been wrung out and hung to dry. But Marcus insisted I come to this engagement party for his fiancée's sister. Family obligation, he called it. More like a command performance. The house smelled like money and white orchids, that particular scent that comes from having an event planner who charges more per hour than most people make in a week. I could hear voices drifting from the living room, that peculiar pitch of wealthy people pretending they're having a good time while mentally calculating everyone else's net worth. My black Saint Laurent dress was simple, understated, exactly the kind of thing that makes insecure women think you're not trying, when really you're just secure enough not to need the validation. I'd pulled my hair back in a low bun, minimal jewelry except for the Cartier watch my father gave me before he died, back when I still believed families were supposed to protect each other instead of bleeding you dry in increments so small you don't notice until you're empty. Marcus spotted me first, his face lighting up with that particular brand of relief that told me he'd been worried I wouldn't show. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his custom Tom Ford suit probably costing more than the average wedding, and kissed both my cheeks like we were at some European function instead of his fiancé's family gathering. "Ty, thank God, I need you to meet everyone. Vanessa's been asking about you all week." That was Marcus code for his fiancée had been running her mouth about me, probably trying to figure out why her future brother-in-law's sister was such a mystery. I'd met Vanessa exactly twice, both times brief, both times leaving me with the distinct impression that she was the type of woman who measured her worth by the size of her engagement ring and the Instagram likes on her vacation photos. Not that I judged, everyone's got their thing, but it made me tired just thinking about having to perform for her family for the next 3 hours. The living room was packed with the kind of people who summer in the Hamptons and winter in Aspen, all of them holding champagne flutes and wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be literally anywhere else, but were too well-bred to admit it. Vanessa materialized beside Marcus, her hand sliding possessively around his arm, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She was beautiful in that manufactured way, the kind that comes from having a standing appointment with the best dermatologist in Houston and a personal trainer who makes house calls at 5 in the morning. "Tyla, finally! We were starting to think you were a ghost." Her laugh was musical, practiced, the kind of sound that made my teeth ache. I smiled back, equally warm, equally fake. Traffic from the airport was brutal, you know how it is. I didn't mention that I'd actually spent an hour sitting in my rental car in the driveway, debating whether I could fake a sudden illness and flee back to the Houstonian hotel where I was staying, order room service, and pretend this whole evening never happened. Vanessa steered me toward a cluster of people near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the pool, the kind that's more art installation than functional swimming hole. "Everyone, this is Tyla, Marcus's sister." "She's been overseas for work." The way she said work made it sound vaguely suspicious, like maybe I was running guns or laundering money instead of doing whatever it was I actually did. A woman about my age, maybe 32 or 33, turned toward me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost $3,000 and made her look like she was trying too hard. Her blonde hair blown out to perfection, her makeup slightly too heavy for the lighting. "Oh, Marcus's sister. We've heard so much about you." The emphasis on "so much" suggested they'd heard exactly nothing, which tracked with how Marcus and I operated. We loved each other, sure, but we weren't the kind of siblings who shared everything. We'd learned early that information was currency in our family, and you didn't spend it unless you absolutely had to. "I'm Claire," the woman continued, extending a hand with nails so perfect they looked like they'd been painted by a surgeon. "Vanessa's sister. This is my fiancé, David." She gestured to a man beside her, tall, expensively dressed, the kind of generically handsome that comes from good genetics and better grooming. He shook my hand with the grip of someone who'd been taught that a handshake says everything about a man. Firm, but not aggressive, lasting exactly 2 seconds.
Nice to meet you both. Congratulations on the engagement. I was going through the motions, saying the right things, playing the part of the gracious sister-in-law to be, but something about Claire was setting off alarm bells in the back of my head. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces to. Or maybe it was just my general exhaustion making me paranoid. We made small talk for exactly 4 minutes, the kind of conversation that's all surface and no substance, touching on the weather, the traffic, the gorgeous house, all the safe topics that don't require anyone to reveal anything real about themselves. Then Claire's mother joined us, a woman in her 60s who'd clearly had work done, but the good kind, subtle, making her look refreshed instead of surprised. She was wearing diamonds that could fund a small country's GDP and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about money a single day in her life. "You must be Tyla," she said, her accent pure Texas old money, the kind that's been marinating in privilege for generations. "I'm Patricia Montgomery. We're so thrilled Marcus is joining our family." The way she said it made it sound like Marcus was the lucky one, like he should be grateful to be marrying into their dynasty. Never mind that my brother was worth more than everyone in this room combined. Not that anyone needed to know that. Money was something we were taught never to discuss, one of those unspoken rules that separated people like us from people who actually had to work for a living. I was about to respond with something appropriately gracious when Claire cut in, her voice carrying that particular edge that wealthy women use when they're about to draw blood. "So, Tyla, Vanessa mentioned you've been living in Asia. What is it you do, exactly? Teaching English or something?" The room didn't stop. Conversations continued around us, but I felt the shift in attention, the way people's ears perked up even while they pretended not to be listening.
Teaching English was code for couldn't hack it in the real world. A polite way of suggesting I was one of those expats who fled to Asia because they couldn't compete in America. It was meant to diminish me, to put me in my place, to establish the hierarchy of this gathering, with me firmly at the bottom. David was watching me with mild interest, the kind of look men give women they've already categorized as beneath their notice. Vanessa's face was carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, like she'd been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally call out the mysterious sister-in-law who didn't fit into their neat little world of charity galas and country club memberships. I could feel Marcus tense beside me, his protective instinct kicking in, but I touched his arm lightly, a silent signal that I had this under control. The truth was, I'd been dealing with women like Claire my entire life, women who used politeness as a weapon, who could smile while they gutted you, who measured their worth by how effectively they could make other women feel small. I'd just spent 6 years navigating boardrooms full of men who didn't think women belonged there, who questioned every decision I made, who assumed I'd slept my way to whatever success I'd achieved. Claire Montgomery was amateur hour compared to what I dealt with on a daily basis. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice light, conversational, like we were discussing the weather instead of her thinly veiled insult, "I've been working in private equity, venture capital specifically, tech startups, mostly fintech and AI applications." I watched her face carefully, saw the moment she realized she'd miscalculated, that maybe I wasn't the struggling English teacher she'd assumed I was. But Claire wasn't done. She laughed, that particular sound wealthy women make when they're about to deliver a killing blow, disguised as a joke. "Oh, that's adorable. Vanessa, you didn't mention Tyla was in finance? How sweet." She turned to the small group that had gathered around us, her audience fully assembled now. "I just think it's precious when people get into these trendy industries, finance, venture capital, startups. It all sounds so impressive, doesn't it? Though I suppose someone has to handle the administrative side of things." She paused, letting the words sink in, making sure everyone understood what she was implying. "She's just admin, really, not like the real players who are actually making the deals and taking the risks. But someone's got to keep the calendars and file the paperwork, right?" The way she said it, dripping with condescension, making it clear I was some glorified secretary playing dress-up in a world I didn't belong in. The room didn't go silent, not exactly, but there was a shift in energy, that particular charge that happens when someone's crossed a line and everyone's waiting to see what happens next. Patricia Montgomery's expression tightened slightly, a flicker of disapproval crossing her face, but she didn't intervene. David was looking at me now with more interest, like I'd suddenly become worth paying attention to. Marcus was about to say something, his jaw tight with anger, but I squeezed his arm again, harder this time. This was my fight, not his. I'd spent too many years letting other people defend me, hiding behind my father's reputation, my brother's protection, my last name. Claire Montgomery had just made the mistake of assuming I was someone who needed defending. I smiled at her, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that makes people nervous even though they can't quite figure out why. Administrative work is important, I said, my voice even, calm, like we were having a perfectly pleasant conversation. Every successful operation needs strong support staff. I'm sure you'd know all about that, Claire. I let that hang in the air for a moment, the implication clear enough that she'd understand I was suggesting she knew about support staff because that's all she'd ever been herself, despite her expensive dress and her engagement ring and her family's money. But I wasn't done. I'd learned a long time ago that when someone takes a shot at you in public, you don't just defend yourself. You make sure they never try it again. David turned to me then, his expression somewhere between amused and curious, like he was finally seeing me as something other than his fiancé's future sister-in-law's boring sister. So what do you actually do, Tyla? In venture capital, I mean. What's your role? The question could have been innocent, genuine interest, but given the context, given what his fiancé had just said, it felt like a test. Like he was giving me a chance to prove I wasn't what Claire had suggested, or maybe giving me enough rope to hang myself with, to expose myself as the fraud she believed I was. The entire group was watching now. Conversations around us had actually stopped, everyone waiting to see how this played out. Vanessa looked uncomfortable, probably realizing this little dinner party was spiraling into something she hadn't anticipated. Marcus was stone-faced, the way he got when he was furious but trying to maintain composure. I looked at David, then at Claire, then at Patricia, taking my time, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I could tell them I was a partner at one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in Asia, that I'd closed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that I sat on the boards of 3 unicorn companies, and had a reputation in the industry that opened doors most people didn't even know existed. I could pull out my phone and show them the LinkedIn recommendations from CEOs and founders, the Forbes article that mentioned me in passing, the term sheet I'd just signed that would net my firm a return that would make their eyes water. I could lay it all out, prove myself, justify my existence to these people who thought they had the right to judge me based on nothing but their own insecurities and prejudices. But instead, I answered with one word: partner. The room went completely silent this time, no pretending otherwise. Everyone's attention focused on me like I'd just announced I was secretly a Saudi princess or had won the Nobel Prize. The word hung in the air, simple, unadorned, carrying the weight of everything it implied. Not an analyst, not an associate, not even a vice president. Partner. The kind of position that takes a decade or more to achieve in the best firms, the kind of role that comes with wealth and influence and power that most people can't even conceptualize. Claire's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, then comprehension, then something that looked a lot like horror as she realized exactly how badly she'd just screwed up. David's expression changed too, his casual interest sharpening into something more calculating, the look of a man who just realized he'd underestimated someone and was rapidly reassessing the entire situation. But it was Patricia Montgomery's reaction that was most telling. The color drained from her face, her hand reaching out to grip the back of a nearby chair like she needed support. She was looking at me like she'd just seen a ghost, or maybe like she'd just recognized someone she should have known all along but had somehow missed. Her lips parted like she was going to say something, then closed again, her eyes darting to Claire with an expression that was part panic, part fury. Something was happening here that I didn't fully understand, some undercurrent I couldn't quite catch, but I felt it like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. "Partner?" Patricia repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're a partner? At which firm?" There was something in the way she asked it, desperate, needing confirmation, like the answer mattered more than it should have. I told her the name of the firm, watched her face go even paler, if that was possible. It was one of the top 3 PE firms in Asia, the kind of institution that managed billions, that had backed some of the most successful tech companies of the last decade, that wielded the kind of influence that made governments pay attention. The kind of firm that didn't make people partners unless they were exceptional, unless they'd proven themselves beyond any shadow of doubt. "Oh, God," Patricia said, and it wasn't an exclamation, it was more like a prayer, like she was asking for divine intervention in whatever disaster was currently unfolding. She turned to Claire, her expression hard now, all that cultivated grace replaced with something raw and real. "Did you know? Did Vanessa tell you?" Claire was shaking her head, looking between her mother and me like she was trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. "Know what? I don't understand what's happening right now." She looked at me, and I could see the fear starting to creep in around the edges of her bravado, that instinctive understanding that something had shifted, that she was no longer in control of the situation. Marcus had gone very still beside me, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. He was putting it together faster than I was, his mind already racing ahead to whatever conclusion everyone else in this room seemed to have reached, except me and Claire. Vanessa had disappeared, I noticed, slipped away at some point during the confrontation, probably hiding in the kitchen or the bathroom, or anywhere she didn't have to witness whatever was about to happen. David was staring at his fiancé like he'd never seen her before, like she just transformed into a stranger in front of his eyes. And then Patricia Montgomery said something that made the entire evening pivot on its axis, that turned what had been a simple social confrontation into something infinitely more complicated. "Claire, darling, you've just insulted your fiancé's boss." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching everything. I felt my own confusion spike because that didn't make sense. I didn't know David, had never met him before tonight, couldn't possibly be his boss. But then Patricia continued, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "David works for Tyler's firm. He's been trying to make partner for 3 years. His entire career, his entire future, depends on the evaluation and recommendation of the senior partners." She looked at me now, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of damage done and whether it could be undone, particularly the partners who oversee the Houston expansion project, which I believe David mentioned you were spearheading. Time seemed to slow down, everything clicking into place with horrible, perfect clarity. David's face had gone completely white, all the blood draining away as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened, what his fiancée had just done to his career prospects. "I didn't recognize him because I'd never met him in person. We'd only exchanged emails about the Houston office, preliminary discussions about whether he'd be a good fit for the partnership track. His application was sitting on my desk in Singapore right now, waiting for my review when I got back. My recommendation carrying enormous weight because I was the partner in charge of the expansion, because my word could make or break his career aspirations. And his fiancé had just spent the last 15 minutes treating me like I was beneath her notice, insulting me, diminishing my work, calling me glorified admin in front of a room full of people who would undoubtedly talk about this for weeks to come. I could see David doing the math in real time, calculating exactly how badly this could go for him, whether there was any way to salvage the situation, or if his partnership dreams had just evaporated in front of his eyes. Claire was looking between us, understanding dawning on her face with the slow horror of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. She'd been so confident, so sure of herself, so convinced that she was the one with power in the situation. And now she was realizing that she'd just detonated a bomb that could destroy everything she and David had been building toward. The Montgomery family money was considerable, sure, but partnership at a top-tier PE firm was the kind of achievement that transcended family wealth, that opened doors even their connections couldn't touch, that represented validation and prestige and power in a world where those things mattered more than the size of your trust fund. I should clarify, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I'm not David's boss. Not yet, anyway. I'm on the committee that's reviewing his partnership application, along with 4 other senior partners. We'll be making our final decision in about 6 weeks after I complete my review of his performance metrics, deal history, and cultural fit with the firm. I let that sit for a moment, watching David's face cycle through expressions like he was auditioning for a role in a tragedy. Cultural fit is particularly important to us. We're looking for partners who demonstrate judgment, discretion, the ability to navigate complex social and professional situations without creating unnecessary conflicts. People who understand how to build relationships, how to treat colleagues and clients with respect, regardless of their perceived status or position. Every word was a nail in a coffin, and I wasn't even trying to be cruel. I was just stating facts, explaining our evaluation criteria, but it was clear to everyone in the room exactly how David's fiancé's behavior reflected on his judgment and character. Claire started to say something, probably an apology or an explanation or some desperate attempt to walk back the last 15 minutes, but Patricia cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not now, Claire." She turned to me, her face a mask of professional courtesy that was clearly costing her tremendous effort to maintain. "Tyla, I apologize for my daughter's behavior. It was inappropriate and uncalled for. I hope you'll understand that she didn't mean any real harm. She was just being thoughtless. It was a good attempt at damage control, the kind of smooth recovery that came from decades of navigating high society disasters. But we both knew it was too little, too late. You can't unring a bell. You can't unsay words that have already been spoken in front of witnesses. You can't undo the impression that's already been made." "I'm sure she didn't," I said, keeping my tone neutral, professional, giving nothing away about what I was actually thinking or feeling. The truth was, I was angry, but not for the reasons everyone probably assumed. I'd been insulted before. Dismissed, underestimated, had my competence questioned by people who should have known better. That part didn't bother me anymore. I'd developed thick enough skin to let that kind of thing roll off my back. What bothered me was the casual cruelty of it. The way Claire had tried to diminish me, not because I'd done anything to her, not because she had any real grievance, but just because she could, because it made her feel bigger to make someone else feel smaller. That kind of behavior, that instinct to hurt people just to assert dominance, told me everything I needed to know about her character, and by extension, about David's judgment in choosing her as a partner. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I think maybe we should head out, Ty. It's been a long day. You're probably exhausted from the flight." He was giving me an exit, a graceful way to leave this disaster of a party before things got even worse, and I was grateful for it. But before I could agree, before I could make my excuses and walk out of this marble palace and never look back, David found his voice. "Tyla, please, I'm so sorry about all this. Claire didn't know. She never would have said those things if she'd known who you were." It was exactly the wrong thing to say, implying that the insult was only wrong because of who I was, not because it was inherently disrespectful and cruel regardless of my position or status. It told me that David had learned nothing from this encounter, that he still didn't understand the fundamental problem with what had happened here tonight. "That's the issue, though, isn't it?" I said, looking directly at David, making sure he understood what I was about to say. She wouldn't have said those things if she'd known who I was, but she was perfectly comfortable saying them when she thought I was nobody important. That tells me what I need to know about both of you. I picked up my clutch from where I'd set it on a side table, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but here, to be back in my hotel room or on a plane back to Singapore, or literally anywhere that wasn't this moment. "I'll complete my review of your application according to our normal timeline, David. You'll hear from the committee in 6 weeks, same as everyone else being considered for partnership this cycle." It was professional, appropriate, exactly what I should say, but we both knew what it meant. We both knew that barring some miracle, his chances of making partner had just evaporated, along with Claire's composure. I turned to leave, Marcus falling into step beside me, and that's when Vanessa reappeared from wherever she'd been hiding. She looked terrified, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the panic in her eyes. "Tyla, please don't go. We can fix this. Claire didn't mean anything by it. She's just protective of her family, of David. You understand, right? I know you and Marcus aren't always super close, but you'd protect him too if someone was threatening his career." It was a desperate play, trying to appeal to some sense of family loyalty, trying to reframe Claire's behavior as protective rather than cruel, but it fell flat. The idea that I'd been threatening David's career was absurd. I'd never even met the man before tonight, had no idea he was going to be at this party, had no agenda beyond showing up to support my brother because he'd asked me to.
Vanessa, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous in a way I'd rarely heard it. I think you need to stop talking right now. There was something in his tone that made her step back, that made her realize she was about to make things even worse than they already were. He looked at his fiancé like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, taking in not just her beauty and her family's wealth and her social connections, but the person underneath all of that, the kind of person who would stand by while her sister humiliated his sister, who would try to excuse and justify that behavior instead of condemning it. I could see the relationship fracturing in real time, hairline cracks spreading through the foundation they'd built, and I felt a pang of guilt even though none of this was my fault. I hadn't asked to be insulted, hadn't asked to be put in this position, hadn't asked for any of this. We made it to the foyer, my heels clicking against that same marble floor, but this time the sound felt different, final somehow, like I was walking away from more than just a bad party. Patricia Montgomery followed us, her face composed now, back to that mask of social grace, but her eyes were calculating, assessing, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this situation. "Tyla, I hope you'll consider coming to the wedding. Both weddings, actually. I know tonight didn't go as any of us planned, but family is family, and Marcus is becoming part of ours." It was a masterclass in damage control, acknowledging the disaster while simultaneously trying to move past it, to normalize the situation and pretend it could all be forgotten with time and goodwill. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, and turned back to face her. "Mrs. Montgomery, I appreciate the invitation, but I think we both know that wouldn't be appropriate under the circumstances. I'll be back in Singapore before either wedding takes place, and honestly, I think everyone would be more comfortable if I kept my distance from your family's celebrations." It was diplomatic, professional, the kind of response that couldn't be criticized but made my position perfectly clear. I wasn't going to pretend this hadn't happened, wasn't going to play nice for the sake of social convention, wasn't going to make this easy for any of them. They'd made their choices tonight, had revealed who they were and what they valued, and now they got to live with the consequences. "But what about David's application?" Patricia asked, and there it was. The real concern, the thing she actually cared about. Not my feelings, not the insult her daughter had delivered, not the cruelty of what had happened, but the practical matter of whether her future son-in-law's career could be saved. "You'll still give him a fair evaluation, won't you, despite tonight?" It was almost funny the way she was trying to appeal to my professionalism while simultaneously reminding me that I had power in this situation, that I could hurt them if I wanted, that they were at my mercy. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman whose daughter had just called me glorified admin was now begging me to be fair to the man who'd chosen that daughter as his life partner. "I'll evaluate David's application based on the same criteria we use for every candidate: his technical skills, his deal history, his cultural fit with our organization, his judgment in complex situations. The committee will review all the evidence and make a decision based on what's best for the firm." It wasn't a promise of fairness, and it wasn't a threat of retaliation. It was just a statement of fact. But I could see Patricia trying to read between the lines, trying to figure out if there was any hope or if this night had killed David's dreams. The truth was, I didn't know yet what I was going to recommend. Part of me wanted to judge him purely on his professional merits, to be the bigger person and not let his fiancé's behavior color my assessment of his capabilities.
But another part of me, the part that had spent the last 15 minutes being publicly humiliated for sport, wondered what kind of man proposes to a woman like Claire, what that choice said about his values and his character and his judgment. Marcus and I drove away from that mansion in silence, both of us processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of an evening that had gone from tedious to nightmarish in the span of about 20 minutes. The Houston streets were quiet, the wealthy neighborhoods we drove through pristine and perfect, every lawn manicured, every hedge trimmed, every house a monument to success and stability and the American dream. It all looked so peaceful from the outside, so perfect, but I'd just gotten a glimpse behind the curtain, seen the pettiness and cruelty and desperation that lurked beneath all that polished surface. "You okay?" Marcus finally asked as we pulled up to my hotel. His face was drawn, tired, like he'd aged a decade in the last hour. That was beyond messed up. I'm so sorry, Ty. I had no idea Claire was like that. Vanessa never said anything. If I'd known... I cut him off with a gesture, suddenly too exhausted to rehash it all. "It's not your fault. You couldn't have known." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true, if there had been signs he'd missed or chosen to ignore, if Vanessa had shown him who she really was and he just hadn't wanted to see it. I got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking up at the hotel's facade, expensive and anonymous, a place to sleep but not a home. "Are you still going to marry her?" I asked, the question hanging between us like a challenge. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly gone unstable. "I don't know," he finally said, and the honesty in his voice made my chest ache. "I really don't know anymore." We said goodnight and I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the Houston night, and I felt the weight of what had happened settling over me like a blanket. This wasn't over, I realized. Tonight hadn't been an ending, it had been a beginning, the first act in something bigger that I didn't fully understand yet. Patricia Montgomery's reaction had been too extreme, her panic too real for this to just be about a partnership application and a social faux pas. There was something else going on here, some other layer to this situation that I was missing, something that connected me to these people in a way I hadn't realized. I got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking up at the hotel's facade, expensive and anonymous, a place to sleep but not a home. "Are you still going to marry her?" I asked, the question hanging between us like a challenge. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly gone unstable. "I don't know," he finally said, and the honesty in his voice made my chest ache. "I really don't know anymore." We said goodnight and I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the Houston night, and I felt the weight of what had happened settling over me like a blanket. This wasn't over, I realized. Tonight hadn't been an ending, it had been a beginning, the first act in something bigger that I didn't fully understand yet. Patricia Montgomery's reaction had been too extreme, her panic too real for this to just be about a partnership application and a social faux pas. There was something else going on here, some other layer to this situation that I was missing, something that connected me to these people in a way I hadn't realized. I took the elevator up to my room, let myself in, kicked off those Valentino heels, and sank onto the bed without bothering to undress. My phone buzzed with messages, probably from Marcus checking if I was okay, maybe from Vanessa trying to apologize or explain, or somehow make this right. I ignored them all, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the evening in my head. The moment when Claire's face had gone from smug to horrified, the way Patricia Montgomery had looked at me like I was a bomb that had just gone off in the middle of her perfectly planned party. The calculation in David's eyes as he realized his entire future might have just been destroyed by his fiancé's need to feel superior. And underneath it all, that nagging sense that I was missing something, that there was a piece of this puzzle that hadn't been revealed yet, that would change everything once I finally understood what it was.
I fell asleep like that, still dressed, the lights still on, dreaming about marble floors and champagne flutes and the particular sound a room makes when everyone in it realizes that the power dynamic they thought they understood had just been completely inverted.
I woke up at 3 in the morning, Houston time, my body still on Singapore hours, my mind churning through the events of the previous evening like it was trying to solve an equation with variables I couldn't quite identify. The hotel room was dark now, the automatic lights having shut off at some point while I slept, and for a moment I just lay there, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. My phone was lit up with notifications, 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, all of them from the last 6 hours. I scrolled through them with a growing sense of dread, watching the situation I'd walked away from spiral into something much bigger than a simple social confrontation. Marcus had called 4 times, his messages progressing from concern to confusion to something that looked a lot like anger. Vanessa had sent a dozen texts, each one more desperate than the last, begging me to call her, to let her explain, to understand that it was all a misunderstanding. They were messages from numbers I didn't recognize, people I'd met briefly at the party reaching out to apologize or offer support, or probably just fish for information they could use as social currency later. But it was the email sitting at the top of my inbox that made me sit up fully, my exhaustion evaporating like it had never existed, replacing it with a cold clarity that made my hands shake slightly as I opened it. The email was from Richard Chen, the managing partner of our firm, sent at midnight Houston time, which meant it was noon in Singapore, and he was in the office, probably dealing with whatever situation had prompted him to write to me in the middle of my supposed vacation. The subject line read, "Urgent, Houston expansion and David Montgomery partnership application," and I felt my stomach drop even before I read the first line. Richard wasn't someone who used words like urgent lightly, wasn't someone who involved himself in individual partnership decisions unless something had gone seriously wrong. I read through his email twice, then a third time, trying to process what he was telling me, the implications of what had happened while I'd been sleeping off the disastrous party. Apparently, David's mother, Patricia Montgomery, had spent the evening making phone calls, using every connection she had, pulling strings I didn't even know existed, trying to do damage control for her future son-in-law's career prospects. She'd reached out to 3 of our firm's limited partners, wealthy investors who had significant influence over strategic decisions, and somehow convinced them that there was a conflict of interest in my evaluation of David's application, that I had a personal vendetta against him based on family drama, that my judgment was compromised and I shouldn't be on the review committee. It was a smart play, actually, the kind of move that showed Patricia Montgomery was far more formidable than I'd given her credit for. She'd bypassed the normal channels, gone straight to the people with real power, and framed the situation in a way that made me look like the problem instead of her daughter's behavior being the issue. Richard's email was careful, diplomatic, making it clear that he didn't believe I was actually compromised, but that the limited partners had raised concerns that needed to be addressed. He was asking me to recuse myself from David's evaluation to let the other partners on the committee make the decision without my input, essentially removing me from a process I'd been leading for the last 6 months. It wasn't quite a reprimand, but it wasn't a vote of confidence either, and I could read between the lines of his carefully worded paragraphs to understand that this situation had created political complications that extended far beyond one partnership application. I sat there in the dark hotel room, my laptop screen the only source of light, and felt something shift inside me. I'd spent the last 6 years building my career with careful precision, proving myself over and over again in an industry that didn't want to make room for women like me, establishing a reputation for judgment and competence that had earned me respect even from people who didn't particularly like me. I'd made partner younger than almost anyone in the firm's history, had closed deals that other people said were impossible, had built relationships and networks that were worth more than any dollar amount you could put on them,
And now, Patricia Montgomery, a woman I'd met for all of 5 minutes, was trying to undermine all of that because her daughter had decided to use me as a punching bag at a party, and it had backfired spectacularly. The rage that I'd been suppressing since the previous evening came flooding back, not hot and explosive, but cold and calculating. The kind of anger that clarifies rather than clouds, that sharpens your thinking instead of overwhelming it. I wrote back to Richard, keeping my tone professional, agreeing to recuse myself from David's evaluation, while making it very clear that I believed this was a mistake, that allowing outside pressure to influence our internal processes set a dangerous precedent that would come back to haunt us. I explained the situation as objectively as I could, laid out exactly what had happened at the party, made sure he understood that my only interaction with David had been those few minutes of conversation before his fiancé had insulted me and his future mother-in-law had panicked. I didn't editorialize, didn't let my emotions bleed into the text, just presented the facts and let Richard draw his own conclusions. Then I closed my laptop, got up, took a shower that was probably longer than necessary, and started making a mental list of everything I needed to understand about the Montgomery family and why Patricia had reacted the way she had. Because that reaction, that immediate panic when she'd learned who I was, that wasn't just about protecting David's career. That was something deeper, something personal, something that connected me to these people in a way that hadn't been explained yet. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed, caffeinated, and sitting in the hotel's business center with my laptop and 3 different browser windows open, diving into research with the kind of focused intensity I usually reserved for due diligence on potential investments. Patricia Montgomery's background was exactly what I'd expected. Old Texas money, family fortune built on oil and real estate, the kind of wealth that had been compounding for 3 generations and showed no signs of slowing down. Her husband, Charles Montgomery, had been a successful commercial real estate developer before he died 7 years ago, leaving her with a fortune estimated somewhere in the hundreds of millions and a social position that made her one of the most influential women in Houston's elite circles. Claire was her oldest daughter, 33, had gone to SMU, worked briefly in her father's company before deciding that charity work and planning her wedding were more fulfilling uses of her time. There was another daughter, Vanessa, who'd apparently decided that marrying my brother was her ticket to maintaining the lifestyle she'd been born into. Standard stuff, the kind of biography you could piece together from society pages and LinkedIn profiles. Nothing that explained Patricia's reaction to learning who I was. I dug deeper, going back further, looking at Patricia's history before she married into the Montgomery fortune. Her maiden name was Patricia Hartley. She'd grown up in Austin, had gone to UT, met Charles Montgomery at a charity function when she was 24, and married him 6 months later. Pretty standard story for a woman of her generation and social class, nothing remarkable about it. But then I found something that made me pause. A small detail in an old newspaper article about their engagement that had been digitized and thrown onto the internet where it would live forever. The article mentioned that Patricia had been working as an executive assistant at a venture capital firm in Austin when she met Charles, that she'd been building an impressive career in finance before deciding to focus on family life instead. Executive assistant at a venture capital firm. The phrase triggered something in my memory, some fragment of conversation I'd half forgotten, and I sat there trying to piece together why it felt significant. Then it hit me. And when it did, I felt the air leave my lungs like I'd been punched in the chest. Me as a punching bag at a party, and it had backfired spectacularly. The rage that I'd been suppressing since the previous evening came flooding back, not hot and explosive, but cold and calculating. The kind of anger that clarifies rather than clouds, that sharpens your thinking instead of overwhelming it. I wrote back to Richard, keeping my tone professional, agreeing to recuse myself from David's evaluation, while making it very clear that I believed this was a mistake, that allowing outside pressure to influence our internal processes set a dangerous precedent that would come back to haunt us.
I explained the situation as objectively as I could, laid out exactly what had happened at the party, made sure he understood that my only interaction with David had been those few minutes of conversation before his fiancé had insulted me and his future mother-in-law had panicked. I didn't editorialize, didn't let my emotions bleed into the text, just presented the facts and let Richard draw his own conclusions. Then I closed my laptop, got up, took a shower that was probably longer than necessary, and started making a mental list of everything I needed to understand about the Montgomery family and why Patricia had reacted the way she had. Because that reaction, that immediate panic when she learned who I was, that wasn't just about protecting David's career. That was something deeper, something personal, something that connected me to these people in a way that hadn't been explained yet. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed, caffeinated, and sitting in the hotel's business center with my laptop and 3 different browser windows open, diving into research with the kind of focused intensity I usually reserved for due diligence on potential investments. Patricia Montgomery's background was exactly what I'd expected. Old Texas money, family fortune built on oil and real estate, the kind of wealth that had been compounding for 3 generations and showed no signs of slowing down. Her husband, Charles Montgomery, had been a successful commercial real estate developer before he died 7 years ago, leaving her with a fortune estimated somewhere in the hundreds of millions and a social position that made her one of the most influential women in Houston's elite circles. Claire was her oldest daughter, 33, had gone to SMU, worked briefly in her father's company before deciding that charity work and planning her wedding were more fulfilling uses of her time. There was another daughter, Vanessa, who had apparently decided that marrying my brother was her ticket to maintaining the lifestyle she'd been born into. Standard stuff, the kind of biography you could piece together from society pages and LinkedIn profiles. Nothing that explained Patricia's reaction to learning who I was. I dug deeper, going back further, looking at Patricia's history before she married into the Montgomery fortune. Her maiden name was Patricia Hartley. She'd grown up in Austin, had gone to UT, met Charles Montgomery at a charity function when she was 24, and married him 6 months later. Pretty standard story for a woman of her generation and social class. Nothing remarkable about it. But then I found something that made me pause. A small detail in an old newspaper article about their engagement that had been digitized and thrown onto the internet where it would live forever. The article mentioned that Patricia had been working as an executive assistant at a venture capital firm in Austin when she met Charles, that she'd been building an impressive career in finance before deciding to focus on family life instead. Executive assistant at a venture capital firm. The phrase triggered something in my memory, some fragment of conversation I'd half forgotten, and I sat there trying to piece together why it felt significant. Then it hit me, and when it did, I felt the air leave my lungs like I'd been punched in the chest. My father had worked at a venture capital firm in Austin. Before he'd moved to Houston, before he'd started his own fund, before he'd met my mother and built the life I'd grown up in, he'd been a partner at a small firm called Hartley Ventures, named after the founder, a man who'd built his reputation backing tech startups in the early 80s before anyone else saw the potential. I'd heard stories about those days, vague references to the Austin years that my father didn't talk about much, a chapter of his life that seemed to exist in a separate compartment from everything that came after. I opened a new browser window, searched for Hartley Ventures, found a few old articles about the firm's early successes, and there it was, buried in a business profile from 1987, a list of the firm's employees, including Patricia Hartley, executive assistant to the managing partners. The managing partners at that time had been Raymond Hartley, the founder of the firm, and my father, David Chen, who joined the firm 2 years after graduating from Wharton and quickly proved himself to be one of the most talented investors of his generation. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through implications and connections, trying to understand what this meant. Patricia Montgomery had worked for my father. She'd been his assistant, had probably handled his schedule and his correspondence and all the administrative details that kept his work life running smoothly. That's why she'd panicked when she learned who I was, why she'd gone pale, why she'd immediately started doing damage control.
She knew exactly what the name Tyla Chen meant, knew exactly who my father had been, and for some reason, that knowledge had terrified her. I kept digging, searching for more information about my father's time at Hartley Ventures, looking for some explanation for why Patricia's past employment would trigger such an extreme reaction. The firm had been successful in its early years, had backed several companies that went on to be major players in the tech industry, but it had dissolved in 1989, just 2 years after that article was written. My father had left Austin, moved to Houston, started his own fund with money from investors who'd made fortunes from his earlier deals. He'd never really explained why he'd left, why he'd walked away from a partnership that was printing money, and I'd never thought to ask, because by the time I was old enough to be curious, he was already sick, already dying, and there were more important things to talk about than decades-old career decisions. I found an obituary for Raymond Hartley, the founder of the firm, who died in 1994. It was brief, mentioned his contributions to the Austin business community, his support for local charities, survived by his wife Margaret and his daughter Patricia. Patricia Hartley was Raymond Hartley's daughter. Patricia Montgomery, the woman whose daughter had insulted me, whose future son-in-law I'd been evaluating for partnership, was the daughter of my father's former business partner. That connection alone was enough to explain her panic, the immediate recognition of my name, the desperate attempts to protect David's career from any potential fallout. But it still didn't explain why the firm had dissolved, why my father had left, what had happened in those Austin years that was significant enough to still cause ripples decades later. I called Marcus, not caring that it was barely 7 in the morning, needing to talk to someone who might have information I didn't. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep and stress. "Ty, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all night. We need to talk about what happened, about Vanessa and her family, about all of this mess."
Did you know Patricia Montgomery was Raymond Hartley's daughter? I asked, cutting straight to the point because I didn't have time for preamble. There was silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought maybe we'd been disconnected. Then Marcus let out a long breath. "Yeah, I knew. Vanessa mentioned it a while back, said her grandfather had been in venture capital before he passed away, that he'd worked with Dad back in the day. I didn't think it was important, just one of those small world coincidences that happen in business circles. Why?" His tone had shifted, becoming more alert, picking up on something in my voice that told him this was significant. I explained what I'd found, the timeline of events, Patricia's employment at Hartley Ventures, the firm's dissolution, the way everything seemed to connect in ways that weren't quite clear yet. "Did Dad ever talk to you about those years? About why he left Austin, why Hartley Ventures shut down?" Marcus was quiet again, thinking, trying to remember conversations from decades ago that might have seemed unimportant at the time. "Not really. I remember him mentioning once that he and Raymond Hartley had different visions for the firm's future, that they'd parted ways amicably, but that was it. He never went into detail, and I never pushed because it seemed like ancient history." "You think there's more to it?" "I think Patricia Montgomery's reaction last night was about more than just protecting her future son-in-law's career," I said, my mind working through possibilities, trying to connect dots that might not actually form a coherent picture. "I think there's something about Dad's time in Austin, something about his relationship with Raymond Hartley that we don't know about, something significant enough that Patricia panicked when she realized who I was." Marcus let out a low whistle, the sound of someone who just realized a situation was more complicated than they'd thought. "Okay, so what do we do? How do we find out what actually happened?" I was about to answer when my laptop pinged with a new email notification. Another message from Richard Chen, this one much shorter than the first. "Tyla, we need to talk immediately. Patricia Montgomery has made additional allegations regarding your father's time at Hartley Ventures. Please call me as soon as you receive this, regardless of the hour in Houston." My blood ran cold, the implications of those 2 sentences hitting me like a freight train. Patricia wasn't just trying to protect David's career, she was going on the offensive, attacking my father's reputation, trying to undermine me by casting doubt on where I came from and how I'd gotten to where I was. I told Marcus I'd call him back, hung up, and immediately dialed Richard's number.
He answered before the first ring finished, his voice tight with stress. "Tyla, thank you for calling back so quickly. We have a situation that needs to be addressed immediately." He didn't waste time with pleasantries, jumping straight into the details with the efficiency of someone who'd been dealing with this crisis for hours while I'd been sleeping. Patricia Montgomery has been making calls all night, not just to our limited partners but to others in the industry, spreading a story about your father's departure from Hartley Ventures. She's claiming that he engaged in financial impropriety, that he stole proprietary deal information when he left the firm, that the dissolution of Hartley Ventures was directly caused by his unethical behavior. She's suggesting that your entire career has been built on advantages gained from your father's misdeeds, that you've traded on his reputation while hiding its true nature. Each accusation felt like a physical blow, not because I believed they were true, but because I understood the damage they could do regardless of their veracity. In the world of high finance, reputation was everything, and once it was tarnished, even with lies, it was almost impossible to fully restore.
That's completely fabricated, I said, my voice steady even though I felt like I was standing on ground that was crumbling beneath my feet. My father was one of the most ethical people I've ever known. He would never have engaged in the kind of behavior she's describing. But even as I said it, I realized I was defending someone I'd idolized, but maybe hadn't fully known, not when it came to his professional life before I was born. "Richard, my father died when I was 23. I don't have detailed knowledge of his career in the 80s, but I know the man he was, and I know the values he lived by. Whatever Patricia Montgomery is claiming, there has to be another explanation." Richard sighed, the sound of someone caught between believing in an employee and managing political realities that didn't care about belief. "I don't doubt that, Tyla. But the problem is, she's not just making accusations, she's providing documentation, old emails, memos, board meeting notes from Hartley Ventures that seem to support her version of events. I don't know if they're genuine or if they've been manipulated, but they're compelling enough that our limited partners are asking serious questions about your judgment and whether the firm should be associated with potential ethical violations, even ones that allegedly occurred decades ago." I felt the walls closing in, the careful career I'd built threatening to collapse because of accusations I couldn't fully defend against, events that had happened before I was born involving people who were now dead and couldn't tell their side of the story. "I need to see those documents," I said, my mind already shifting into analytical mode, treating this like any other problem that needed solving, rather than a personal attack on my family's legacy. "Whatever Patricia thinks she has, I need to review it and understand what we're actually dealing with." Richard agreed to send everything over immediately, warned me that the situation was evolving quickly and that I needed to be prepared for more revelations, then hung up, leaving me alone with the weight of what was happening. I sat there in the business center, surrounded by generic corporate artwork and the faint smell of coffee from the machine in the corner, and felt something crystallize inside me. Patricia Montgomery had declared war, had decided that the best defense for her daughter's behavior was to go on offense, to destroy me before I could affect David's career, and she was using my father's memory as ammunition. That was a mistake, a fundamental miscalculation of who I was and what I was capable of, and I was going to make sure she understood exactly how badly she'd misjudged the situation. The documents Richard sent over arrived an hour later, a massive file containing what appeared to be internal communications from Hartley Ventures spanning 1987 to 1989. I read through everything methodically, taking notes, cross-referencing dates and details, applying the same analytical approach I used when evaluating potential investments. The story Patricia was trying to tell was clear enough. My father had allegedly identified a promising startup, had convinced Hartley Ventures to pass on the investment, then had secretly backed it with his own money before leaving the firm and reaping massive returns that should have belonged to his partners. The documentation seemed to support this narrative. Emails where my father had argued against the investment, board notes where he'd cited concerns about the market timing and the founder's experience, correspondence with the startup CEO that suggested a relationship that extended beyond casual professional interaction. It was compelling,
carefully constructed, the kind of evidence that would make anyone question what had actually happened. But I'd spent years learning to spot inconsistencies in financial documents, to identify the gaps between what people wanted you to believe and what the data actually showed. And something about these documents felt off. I started with the timestamps on the emails, checking them against what I knew about my father's schedule during those years, and found the first major discrepancy. One of the emails allegedly showing my father privately negotiating with the startup CEO was dated 2 weeks before a conference where, according to an old article I found, my father had first publicly met that CEO for the first time. Another email referenced a deal structure that hadn't been invented until 3 years after it was supposedly written, a term sheet format that didn't exist in 1988 but had become standard in the early 90s. The more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found, small details that might escape casual scrutiny but added up to a clear picture. These documents had been fabricated, or at minimum heavily altered, by someone who understood the general contours of what venture capital looked like in the 80s, but didn't have the deep knowledge to make the forgery perfect. I documented every inconsistency, built a case file that laid out exactly how I knew these documents were fake, and felt a cold satisfaction settling over me. Patricia Montgomery had underestimated me, had assumed I would either accept her accusations or defend myself emotionally rather than analytically. She'd given me exactly what I needed to destroy her credibility completely. But I still didn't understand why. Why go to all this trouble? Why risk exposure as someone who would manufacture evidence and slander the dead just to protect David's partnership chances? The level of effort Patricia had put into this, the careful construction of fake documents, the aggressive outreach to our limited partners, the systematic attempt to destroy my reputation, all of it suggested something bigger was at stake than one man's career prospects. I went back to the Hartley Ventures history, reading every article and profile I could find, looking for the missing piece that would make sense of Patricia's actions. Then I found it, buried in a bankruptcy filing from 1994, 5 years after the firm had dissolved. Raymond Hartley had filed for personal bankruptcy, listing debts of nearly $40 million, claiming that the dissolution of Hartley Ventures had destroyed his wealth and left him unable to meet his financial obligations. The timing was interesting. The firm had dissolved in 1989, but he hadn't filed for bankruptcy until 5 years later, which suggested he'd been trying to rebuild his finances after the firm's collapse and had failed. The bankruptcy documents listed his assets at the time of filing, and one item caught my eye: a 25% stake in a company called Next Gen Solutions, valued at $0 in the filing because the company had just gone through a failed funding round and was about to shut down. Next Gen Solutions. I typed the name into Google and felt my heart rate spike as the results loaded. The company hadn't shut down in 1994. It had been acquired in 1995 for $200 million by a tech giant looking to acquire its patent portfolio. That 25% stake Raymond Hartley had owned, the one valued at $0 in his bankruptcy filing, would have been worth $50 million at the acquisition price. But according to the bankruptcy documents, Hartley had been forced to sell his stake to his creditors for almost nothing, had lost his chance at the windfall that would have saved his financial life. And the company that had acquired his stake from those creditors, the entity that had ultimately profited from the Next Gen acquisition, was a private investment vehicle called Chen Holdings, owned by my father. My father had ended up with Raymond Hartley's stake in Next Gen Solutions, had profited from Hartley's bankruptcy, had made $50 million off his former partner's financial collapse. That was what Patricia Montgomery was really angry about. That was the source of her hatred for my family, not some manufactured story about stolen deals, but the genuine resentment that came from watching her father destroyed financially, while his former partner became wealthy beyond measure. The ethical calculus of what my father had done was complicated, more complicated than I wanted to think about in a hotel business center at 8 in the morning while dealing with a crisis that threatened everything I'd built. Buying distressed assets from creditors wasn't illegal, wasn't even particularly unusual in business circles, but doing it to your former partner's assets while he was going through bankruptcy had a moral dimension that was harder to justify. I didn't know the full context, didn't know if my father had tried to help Hartley in other ways, didn't know if there was history between them that explained the decision to profit from his partner's collapse. All I knew was that Patricia Montgomery had grown up watching her father's financial destruction while the man who'd been his partner thrived, had seen her family's wealth and status crumble while the Chen family built an empire, and she'd been carrying that resentment for 30 years, waiting for a chance to strike back. My existence, my success, my position of power over her future son-in-law's career had given her that chance, and she was taking it with everything she had. The fake documents weren't about proving anything real. They were about destroying my reputation the same way she believed my father had destroyed her family, about evening a score that had been accumulating interest for 3 decades. I called Marcus back and laid out everything I'd discovered, watched him process the information in real time, heard him struggle with the same ethical questions I was wrestling with. "So Dad did profit from Raymond Hartley's bankruptcy," he said slowly, trying to understand what that meant about the man we'd thought we knew. "But Patricia's documents are fake, manufactured to make it look worse than it was?" I confirmed that was the situation as I understood it, explained the inconsistencies I'd found, the careful forgery that someone had constructed to support a narrative that mixed truth and lies in ways that were hard to untangle. "The question is what we do about it," I said, voicing the dilemma I'd been turning over since I'd understood the full picture. "I can expose Patricia's fake documents, can prove she's been spreading manufactured evidence and destroy her credibility completely. But doing that means the real story comes out, means everyone learns that our father profited from his partner's bankruptcy. And even though it was legal, it's going to raise questions about his ethics, and by extension, ours." Marcus was quiet for a long time, the kind of silence that meant he was thinking through all the angles, considering not just what was legal or provable, but what was right. "What do you think Dad would want us to do?" he finally asked, and I realized that was the question I'd been avoiding asking myself, because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Our father had been a complicated man, brilliant and driven, and occasionally ruthless in the way that successful business people often are, but he'd also instilled in us a sense of ethics, a belief that how you made money mattered as much as how much you made. Would he want us to expose Patricia's lies, even if it meant exposing his own morally questionable decision? Would he want us to protect his reputation at the cost of letting false accusations stand? "I think he'd want us to tell the truth," I said finally, committing to a course of action even as I felt the weight of what it would cost. All of it. Not just the parts that make us look good or Patricia look bad, but the whole complicated mess exactly as it happened. I spent the next 3 hours building a comprehensive document that laid out everything I'd discovered, the fake emails and their inconsistencies, the real story of the next-gen solutions stake, and Raymond Hartley's bankruptcy, the ethical gray area of my father's actions, and the clear fabrication of Patricia's accusations. I didn't editorialize, didn't try to justify or excuse, just presented facts with supporting documentation and let them speak for themselves. Then I sent it to Richard Chen with a recommendation: make it public. Not through official firm channels, but through a carefully controlled leak to a journalist I knew, someone who specialized in business ethics stories and could be trusted to present the information fairly. It would be messy, would generate questions and scrutiny, would probably cost me some relationships and maybe some business opportunities. But it would also be honest, would prevent Patricia from controlling the narrative, would ensure that whatever judgment people made about my family and my career was based on truth rather than manufactured evidence and decades-old resentment. Richard called me within minutes of receiving the document, his voice carrying a mix of admiration and concern. "This is bold, Tyla. It's also career suicide if it goes wrong. If people focus on your father's actions rather than Patricia's fabrications, are you sure you want to do this?" I thought about Claire Montgomery calling me glorified admin, about the casual cruelty of people who thought their wealth and status gave them the right to diminish others, about the way Patricia had looked at me with panic and hatred when she'd realized who I was. I thought about my father, who'd built something real from nothing, who'd made mistakes and carried them quietly, who taught me that success meant nothing if you couldn't live with yourself at the end of the day. "I'm sure," I said, meaning it completely. "The truth is always better than a comfortable lie, even when the truth is complicated." Richard agreed to move forward with the plan, warned me again that there would be fallout, then hung up, leaving me to wait for the chaos I'd just set in motion. The article dropped online 6 hours later, carefully researched and fairly presented, laying out both Patricia's fabrications and the more complex reality of what had actually happened 30 years ago. The response was immediate and polarized, some people focusing on the fake documents and Patricia's attempted manipulation, others questioning my father's ethics and whether I should be held accountable for his decisions. It was exactly the mess I'd expected, but underneath the noise, there was a thread of respect for the transparency, for being willing to expose my family's flaws rather than hide behind them. David's partnership application was withdrawn 2 days later, not because of anything I recommended, but because he chose to remove himself from consideration. He released a statement apologizing for his fiancé's behavior, acknowledging that Claire had acted inappropriately and taking responsibility for not addressing it in the moment. It was a good statement, probably written by a PR professional, but there was something genuine underneath the polish that made me think maybe he'd learned something from this disaster. Claire and David's engagement was called off a week after that, the announcement buried in a brief Society page note that cited irreconcilable differences and asked for privacy. I heard through Marcus that Claire had been devastated, had genuinely believed that David would stand by her regardless of consequences, and had been shocked when he'd chosen his integrity over their relationship. I felt a flicker of sympathy for her, brief and quickly suppressed, because while I understood that she'd been raised in a world that taught her the wrong values, that didn't excuse her behavior or mean she didn't need to face consequences for her choices.
Patricia Montgomery disappeared from public life after the article, retreating from the charity boards and social obligations that had defined her existence, presumably dealing with the damage to her reputation and the questions about why she'd manufactured evidence against a dead man. I never heard from her directly, no apology or explanation or attempt at reconciliation, which was fine because I didn't need any of those things. The situation had revealed exactly who everyone was, had stripped away the polite facades and exposed the reality underneath. And that clarity was worth more than any apology could have been. Marcus and Vanessa's relationship survived, barely, but it was different now, built on a more honest foundation after they'd both seen what happened when you let family loyalty blind you to ethical problems. They delayed their wedding by a year, spent time in couples counseling, working through trust issues and conflicting values, eventually came out stronger on the other side. Vanessa apologized to me more times than necessary, clearly wrestling with guilt over her sister's behavior and her own role in enabling it. And while I accepted her apologies, I also made sure she understood that actions mattered more than words, that real change required more than just feeling bad about what had happened. The fallout in the professional world was mixed, but ultimately manageable. Some limited partners pulled their funding from our firm, uncomfortable with the controversy or the questions about my father's ethics. Others actually increased their investments, impressed by the transparency and the willingness to confront difficult truths rather than hide from them. My reputation took a hit in some circles, particularly among people who believed family loyalty should trump honesty. But it improved in others, especially among younger professionals who were tired of the old boys club mentality and appreciated seeing someone challenge the status quo. Richard Chen told me privately that the whole situation had actually strengthened my position in the firm, had demonstrated judgment and integrity under pressure, had shown that I could handle a crisis without losing my ethical center.
The Houston expansion project moved forward, eventually opening an office, with David's role filled by someone else, someone whose judgment I trusted implicitly because they'd proven themselves without requiring a dramatic test of character. I flew back to Singapore 3 weeks after that disastrous party, leaving Houston behind with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The city had always been complicated for me, holding both the memories of my father and the weight of expectations I'd spent my whole life trying to navigate. This trip had added new layers to that complexity, had revealed truths about my family's history that I was still processing, had forced me to confront questions about success and ethics and what it means to build something worth having. The flight was long, giving me hours to think without the constant interruption of emails and phone calls and the general chaos that had defined the previous weeks. I thought about Claire Montgomery and the look on her face when she'd realized exactly how badly she'd miscalculated, the mixture of horror and understanding that came from seeing the power dynamics she thought she understood revealed as illusions. I thought about Patricia Montgomery and the 30 years she'd spent nursing resentment over her father's financial collapse, letting that bitterness poison her judgment and drive her to fabricate evidence against people she'd never even met. I thought about my father and the decisions he'd made in those Austin years, the gray areas between legal and ethical that successful people navigate every day, the question of whether you can build something good on morally ambiguous foundations.
Most of all, I thought about that moment in my brother's foyer, standing at the door ready to leave, Patricia Montgomery asking if I would give David a fair evaluation despite everything that had happened, the power I'd had in that moment, the ability to affect someone's entire career trajectory with a single decision, the responsibility that came with holding other people's futures in your hands. I'd told her I would evaluate David based on the same criteria we used for everyone, and I'd meant it, but the truth was more complicated than that. Fairness itself was complicated, required balancing competing values and imperfect information, and the acknowledgement that every decision carried consequences you couldn't fully predict. The best you could do was commit to honesty, to transparency, to being willing to expose your own flaws while holding others accountable for theirs. The best you could do was recognize that power came with responsibility, that success meant nothing if it required you to become someone you couldn't respect. By the time the plane landed in Singapore, I'd made peace with everything that had happened, had integrated it into my understanding of myself and my family and the complicated world we all navigate. The story would follow me for a while, would come up in articles and profiles and conversations with people who wanted to understand what had really happened that night in Houston. I would tell it honestly, without embellishment or excuse, acknowledging both the cruelty of Claire's insult and the ethical complexity of my father's decisions, refusing to simplify a complicated situation just to make myself look better. Because that's what real power looks like, not the ability to control narratives or hide flaws or manipulate others into believing comfortable lies. Real power is the courage to tell the truth, even when it costs you something, to hold yourself to the same standards you apply to others, to build a life and career on a foundation of integrity that can withstand scrutiny because it has nothing to hide. I returned to work the next day, walked into my office overlooking the Singapore skyline, and got back to the work I'd been doing before Houston had interrupted with its drama and revelations. There were deals to close, companies to evaluate, decisions to make that would affect hundreds of people's lives and livelihoods. I did that work with the same commitment to honesty and transparency that had guided me through the Montgomery situation, applying the lessons I'd learned about power and responsibility and the importance of staying true to your values even when it would be easier not to. And when people asked me about that night, about the moment when I'd answered with one word and watched everything shift, I told them the truth. That the real story wasn't about revenge or dramatic reveals, but about the choice to live honestly even when dishonesty would be more comfortable, to hold yourself accountable even when others would let you slide, to build something real instead of something that just looked good from the outside. That was the moral, if there was one, the lesson that mattered more than any dramatic confrontation or satisfying comeuppance. Success built on lies and manipulation would always be fragile, vulnerable to exposure, requiring constant energy to maintain the facade. Success built on truth and integrity might be harder to achieve, might cost you opportunities and relationships and the approval of people who valued convenience over character, but it would last, would create something solid that could weather storms because it had no hidden weaknesses waiting to collapse under pressure. Claire Montgomery had tried to diminish me because it made her feel powerful, and in doing so, she'd revealed exactly how powerless she actually was, how dependent on external validation and social hierarchy, and the approval of people who didn't really matter. Patricia Montgomery had tried to destroy me to protect her family's interests, and in doing so, she'd destroyed her own credibility and exposed the resentment that had been poisoning her life for decades. Both of them had operated from a place of fear, of scarcity, of believing that they could only win if someone else lost. I'd operated from a place of abundance, of confidence, of believing that the truth was always better than a comfortable lie, and that faith had been justified. The room hadn't gone silent because I'd claimed power I didn't have, but because I'd demonstrated power I'd earned through years of hard work and ethical decisions, because I'd shown them exactly who I was in a way that couldn't be dismissed or diminished or explained away. And in that moment, yes, they knew exactly who I was. But more importantly, I knew exactly who I was, and I could live with that person looking back at me from the mirror. That was worth more than any revenge, more than any career success, more than any amount of money or status or power. That was everything.